Good afternoon, everyone. So this video is a continuation of the first video, but this video is more on the programmer side. So it's a step-by-step process of how I was able to achieve this custom migration service, and I wrote the steps down from 1 to 12. So let's get on with the projects. The first thing we have to do, since I'm using Java Spring Boot, is to set up my Spring Boot project on, and you can do that easily on IntelliJ IDEA. If you have the Pro version, you can easily set up a new project. And what you're going to do after that is to include dependencies that you're going to need. So some of the dependencies I used in this project are obviously the starter web, the starter test for my testing environment, Jackson data bind for object mapping, also starter login for logging in error handling basically, and also the login framework, which is log4j2. You could also get JetBrains annotations, which is specifically for this ID. It helps with coloring your annotations properly, I guess. And also Lombok, which gives you annotation options for constructors, getters, and setters, so it's very easy to use. And that is the first step in achieving this project. I think it's the first step in achieving any project, setting up your ID so that you can have, an easy developer experience. Great. Now the second thing we're going to do is understand our Shopify and WooCommerce APIs. We have to familiarize ourselves with the APIs from the API documentations, and that's what I have over here and here. So the first thing we're going to do is understand the REST admin API endpoints and requests. So they're organized by resource types, and we need to use different endpoints depending on our app requirements. But this is the typical pattern it follows: the HTTPS, then the store name .myshopify.com /admin/API, then the version 2024.01. You can actually see the API versions here. They have up to 2023.04. So every 3 months they release new API versions based on the time period you create the API in your Shopify account. That will be the corresponding version you use to access that API endpoint. So back then I used 2023.07, but now that we're in 2024, they have up to 2024.01, and the next one is 2024.04. So you can see that they will release every January, April, July, every 3 months basically. And then resource refers to which category we refer to, basically products or orders or customers, and so on and so forth. So once you take your time to study the post, gets, puts, and delete requests, take your time to study how the post method is constructed. You can see using curl, they have the post request, followed by the pattern, followed by the content type, application JSON, and followed by your access token, which is the access token you would get when you create an API over in your Shopify account, followed by the data, which is what exactly you want to add or what exactly you want to change or remove, basically product and then title. And you can see the response body and the response you get from calling this request. So the first thing we're going to do is try a GET request to get information from our Shopify account and see if it works. So I've copied the format of how the request should look like, and we're going to create our own business. So what they want is our store name and .myshopify.com, the admin API 2024, and the resource. And I'm going to show you the step-by-step process of how do we get this pattern. So let's go back to our store. Right, the first thing we see in settings for Shopify is this. This is our store name, right? So we're going to copy this and paste it over here. So we're going to get HTTPS, copy our name .myshopify.com /admin/API/. Now let's get to the version. What we have to do, as I said before, is create an API over here. So this is what I'm talking about. When you go to apps, and sales channel, you will see the installed apps. As this is the demo account, it doesn't really have anything. What we're going to do is develop apps, right? It will give us a prompt to allow custom app development. We're going to do this and allow custom app development. This allows us to create an app for ourselves. When we create this app, or you can just name it API. So over here in overview, go to configure API admin scopes and just give it all the permissions, read and write, allow everything, so that this API can have full read and write access to it, meaning that you can get information and you can also post information to it. And over here, you'd also see that the API versions have been moved to 2024 as this is January. And save. Great. Now our configurations have been saved. The next place we're going to go to is the API credentials. So it tells us that we don't have any access token yet. To get one, we have to install the app. But over here, we can see our API key and API secret key. Note we have to use this for later when accessing the application to create our endpoint. So let's quickly save this. Save the API key. And save the API secret key as well. Great. And after that, we can install our application. So installing this app gives you access to your data. And just press OK. So now the app has been installed. We can reveal this token. This is the API admin access token that they've been talking about since the beginning. So what we're going to do is reveal this and copy this. You can see that it starts with SHPAT, meaning Shopify access token. Without this access token, you won't be able to access this API, and in general, you won't be able to access your application as a developer. So save this as the API admin access token. And alright, it has been saved. And over app settings, you see here, let's just give a description to access accounts. And there you have it. You have successfully installed your custom app into Shopify that can access your account. So let's go back to our text editor and see what we're going to do. So as we know, the version that we created is version 2024.1, and the resource, let's just get customers for now. Let's go over here and look at customers. So it gets requests for customers.json. You can either create a request like this, customers.json question mark, and put their IDs here, and it will retrieve a list of these customers, or you can put a single customer ID to give you a single customer. So what we're going to do is actually retrieve all the customers. So let's just get customers and place it over here, customers.json. So this will give us a list of all the customers in our Shopify account. Mind you, I have only created one customer for this, which is Finyakon. So when we test this on Postman, we should see that it should successfully give us this customer back. All right, now let's try and test this endpoint. As a backend developer, you should be used to Postman by now and know that this is how you can test your endpoint. So what we're going to do is test this because it's the GET request, and I think we fulfilled all the requirements for this request in particular. So let's go to Postman. Let's head on to Postman and place this over here. As you can see, I've already started to do it, but now I can just copy a request from our text editor onto here. Now, if you try sending this request, it's going to give us an error, which is 4.1 unauthorized. First of all, it's because we didn't list our access token. So there's no way that this request can be authorized. So it tells us invalid API key or access token, unrecognized login, or wrong password. So what we have to do is go to the headers, as that's why I said reading the documentation is really important. We can see here from CURL that in the way this request was created or formatted, they have a dash headers field which takes in the X Shopify access token and our access token. So I'm simply going to copy this, go back to Postman and paste it, right, make it available, and put our access token, which is this. So once we've saved this, it should work. And nice, as we can see that the status is 200 and it has actually brought back our customer field. So we see that it returns the customers, but you have to take note of how it's returning it. It returns an object, just one object, and it's the object of customers. But inside this customers is basically an array of objects. So it saves each customer as an object, then takes it in an array. So it takes the customers from here and stores them as objects. Basically, you can see it over here that Finyakon is one object of customers, and customers is an array of objects. So over time, as you have more and more customers, you have more and more objects inside this customer array that will return as one object. And you can see the first thing, Fin, account, other accounts, 0, state disabled, total spent, 0, and it basically gives us everything we need to know about this customer. So now we know that our GET request is working. If you try a post request, it will also work, and you will see it reflect over here on the front end. Now that we know our endpoint is working, this is where we actually start coding from. If you're using Java Spring Boot, well, you know the obvious things you need to do. First of all, you need models. You need a model directory. Then you need your services directory. You also need your response and request directory if you want to style how you would like to get your responses from Postman. Most importantly, you need your controller directory that stores the endpoints that you can use to now refactor this API endpoint. And for this particular project, you need your API client to help you craft customized methods that easily implement this API endpoint. So take for example my get Shopify customers. It takes in my full Shopify API URL, which stops up to here. I append it with customers.json. Also in the get Shopify products, you can see the same thing. So you adjust it according to what exactly you want to get from Shopify. You can see here the string full URL consists of this, and in the HTTP headers initializer, I set the access token and I set the asset type to application.json, as you can see. Then we follow up by initializing the HTTP entity, which takes in the headers as a parameter. Then using the Shopify response class that I created, which I will display later, it creates the get method that we need to successfully return our get Shopify class. So we can easily use this in our controller class. So you see that I'm using this method in our controller class to get the method, and in our migration service to get it and store it, then migrate it to WooCommerce. The thing you'd always want to do when you're using Java Spring Boot is to define your models. So let's start with Shopify customer and see how I define the model. When you get to the documentation, you actually see that they give you a whole field called the customer response, and it shows you what comprise the customer. So these are the properties: the accepting markets updated are the addresses. Addresses are actually another model, so we'll call that Shopify customer addresses. That stores the address because we could have more than one address. Over here, you can see that addresses is an array of objects. Then we have currency created at default address, which is what I was talking about in the beginning: email marketing consent, first name, ID, last name, and 17 other fields. So what I did was to create it accordingly. So we have the Shopify customer taking in the ID, email, and everything that comprise the Shopify customer model. For places like address, all you have to do is create another class called Shopify address and refer it as a list over here, because that's what it is. So when you go to Shopify address, these are the properties, or rather attributes, of Shopify address, and I'm referencing it in our Shopify customer class. So you have to do this for everything in general to be on the safe side and to not have any problems in future. And for the most important part, the migration logic is really important. So the third step we have is to implement data migration logic, create services or components responsible for fetching data from Shopify and pushing it to WooCommerce. And the first thing I wrote here was authentication. Obtain the API credentials for both Shopify and WooCommerce. Right now, we've done that for Shopify, but we have it for WooCommerce, but I'll get to that later. Then handle the authentication in Spring Boot, which was the get Shopify customer that was shown earlier. Then the data fetching, use Spring Boot REST templates or HTTP clients to interact with Shopify API. And you can see that we've technically done this in that method, get Shopify customers, that we were talking about earlier, to fetch the products, customers, orders, and other relevant information. The first one, we'll get to this later, but the first one is data mapping and transformation. Why we need to accurately construct the models now is so that we can ponder about it later and create corresponding logic that can easily migrate it to WooCommerce. So as I said in the beginning, the first problem is that exporting data does not accurately contain all the information, and the table headers are completely different when it comes to Shopify and WooCommerce. Is that there would be some attributes here in Shopify that would be needed here in WooCommerce, and that is a successful migration. There could also be some data types here, like let's say the ID for a Shopify customer is of type long, but over in WooCommerce it has to be of type int. We would need to find a way or workaround to migrate this data type from here to here, or create a new data migration logic that would also increment this at every customer addition. We could also have the case whereby there isn't data here, but the data is required over here. Let's say WooCommerce requires something new entirely that isn't in our Shopify response. We would have to also create logic for this to be fulfilled. The fourth case is where there is some data in Shopify, e.g. the SMS marketing and the email marketing, but it isn't needed in WooCommerce. The fifth case is where you can have a null field in Shopify, but over in WooCommerce it's required and you have to suggest something for it. So we would have to create another migration logic around this. There are many things that can happen during this whole migration process, which is why we have to accurately design our models and compare the two before we implement our logic. So when you go back to this customer, you can click on him, you can click on Finyakon, and you can see more information about it, right? Email not subscribed, SMS not subscribed. When you go to WooCommerce, you'll notice that some things here are relevant and some aren't, like this email not subscribed and SMS not subscribed. You see that WooCommerce doesn't need some of this information, but WooCommerce needs some of this information, but in another format. The data mapping and transformation logic would be the most important part of this project, as you'd need to study the documentation really well to edit information from Shopify in a way that would fit all the WooCommerce requirements that we need. So now the next thing we're going to do is take a look at the WooCommerce REST API. Now that we've talked about Shopify a lot. So over in our customer properties, we have these following attributes: ID, which is an integer, and if you note the customer properties for Shopify, the ID is actually of type long over here, which is something we need to keep note of. Following that, we have this created GMT, date modified GMT, email, first name, last name, role, username, password, billing, shipping, is paying customer, which is a Boolean value, avatar URL, and metadata. Some of the things that are different here are this created GMT and this modified GMT, and that would automatically update itself once you're pushing the data from Shopify to WooCommerce. There's an email field here, and there's also one in Shopify. But if you take a closer look, this is a mandatory field, meaning it's required, meaning it can never be not null. And one of the problems we could face in doing this is that the email over here in Shopify isn't mandatory. So some fields may actually sign up with their phone numbers on Shopify instead of email, and that could cause a problem later on. So this is something that requires some migration logic to it when we are coding. When we go back to our code, we also have first name, last name. These are all fields that we have in Shopify, so that should be good. We have role. I don't think we have role in Shopify, so we're going to have to do something about that as well. Then we have username. We also don't have usernames over in Shopify, but what we can do is provide a combination of the first name and last name. So for usernames, we're going to concatenate the fields. We don't have passwords as well. We have billing and shipping, but these are objects, so that means these have their own properties that we also have to attend to. The same thing goes for the Shopify addresses. So we have an idea of mapping the attributes of the Shopify addresses to the billing and shipping properties over here in WooCommerce. Then we have is paying customer, which is a Boolean value, which we don't have over in Shopify. So we're going to have to provide something for that. But I think we can just set it to no at first instance. Then we have avatar URL, which we also don't have in Shopify. So we know that we have to set some logic to this, that the user can update their profile picture or their avatar picture. And we have metadata, and this is an array which contains some properties of its own. So let's take a closer look of the general body of how a WooCommerce customer object is built. We have the email, first name, last name, username, the billing information, which is an object of its own, the shipping information, which is also an object of its own. When we try and retrieve a customer, let's go to the HTTP request for getting a customer. I'll get to how we're going to formulate this the same way we did for Shopify. But for now, we're looking at the JSON response example. When they try and get a customer with ID of 25, this is what it will return. So the date created, the date modified, all the properties that we've seen above in the customer properties is exactly what gets returned. The role here is customer, so we should be able to set every role to customer during the migrating process. Then the username is John.doe, which takes the first and last names together and adds a full stop in between, so we can easily concatenate that as well. Then we have the billing and the shipping information, and we have is paying customer false. We can set that to false. Then we have the avatar URL and the metadata. Going back to our code, as you can see, I created 3 classes, one for the customer, one for the address, and one for the metadata, and it contains everything that they listed over in the properties field. For the address section, we have WooCommerce address, billing, and shipping, since they technically have the same attributes. And over in WooCommerce address, we have first name, last name, company, address 1, and so on and so forth. So now this should give you a general idea of matching both Shopify customer properties to WooCommerce customer properties and Shopify address properties to WooCommerce address properties. Hence the emphasis on creating efficient and accurate models for both Shopify and WooCommerce objects, customer objects. After this, we can go to our customer migration service and look at how we paired both of them. Now that we've gotten a grasp of how Shopify APIs interact and how to use them on Java Spring Boot, let's go to the WooCommerce side and see how we can push data into it. The first things first, we have to build an API app here as well. Over in the documentation here, when you go to authentication, you see the REST API keys. And it typically gives you the instructions you need to do. Go to WooCommerce settings, API key, and create a new key. Head on to WooCommerce, then settings, then advanced, and over here, REST APIs. So you can see that I've already created one. So let's go ahead and create another one. We can call this tests and give it read and write permissions. So you'll be able to push your data into it. And nice, we can see it gives us our consumer key and our consumer secret. You could also have it in a QR code if you'd like. So let's just save this in our text editor and save it in a secure file. When you get to Java Spring Boot, you can save it in your application properties. And as I'm posting on GitHub, add the application properties to my gitignore file, so these things won't be accessed so easily, and save my consumer secrets as well. This is what you need to access the API app, so you won't get an error message or 4.1 forbidden. This is all we need, so let's go ahead and test this out. If you notice, there's still something missing. We have to construct our request URL. This is also very important, but don't worry, it should follow a similar pattern like Shopify. If you take a closer look, they actually give us the URL parameters that we need: the app name, the scope, the user ID, return URL, and callback URL, but you don't necessarily need all these things. And most of these you've done on the front end by actually giving a read and write access and your app name, and the rest is what the system takes note of, so we don't have to worry about that. So if you scroll further down, they actually give us a HTTP basic auth example of how to use it: the URL, which takes in the URL name, the consumer key, and the consumer secret, and the version, WooCommerce version 3, right? And if you also look at some of the GET requests, let's scroll further down, you see that it has the GET method followed by this. So from this GET request, what we're going to do is copy this and paste it over here. Nice. But the first segment of the URL is going to be our store name, and in this case, it's going to be feeling.com. So if we test this over Postman and add the consumer key and secrets, it should work. So let's go ahead and do that now. But take note that we want to retrieve something in particular. Is it a customer, is it a product, or is it an order? So all you have to do now is go to the customers field or the orders field or product and copy the URL format that they use. So over here, after version 3, they have customers followed by the ID, but this time around we just want to get all the customers. So what we're going to do is we write this and add customers to the back. Let's go over to Postman and test this out. Once we get here and we add it, let's add it without putting our authorizations first and see what we get. And as you can see, as we expected, it gives us what? A 401 unauthorized, meaning we don't have the required access to this API call. And as you can see, it tells us WooCommerce REST cannot view, sorry, you cannot list resources, blah, 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 blah. What we need to do is go to the authorization page, then go to basic authorization and add your WooCommerce API key and secrets as they intended. So let's go back over to our text edit, copy this. Nice. And copy this as well. Consumer key and consumer secrets. So let's try and send it now. And nice, it has returned all the customers over here on WooCommerce. You can see that the status is 200. So this tells you that you successfully built your request URL. But we can't always depend on using the full request URL. So we're going to build methods around it that can easily call this request for us with the accurate consumer key and secrets. So over here, if we go to the WooCommerce controller, we can actually see a get WooCommerce customers method that I've created in the WooCommerce API client. So let's go there and check it out. So this, like the previous get Shopify customers, does the same thing. It's a method intended to create the URL and then call the method using Java Spring Boot REST templates. So as you can see, string URL, it takes in the WooCommerce API URL, which is in my application properties /customers to get just customers. Afterwards, you can always edit it to get products and get orders. Then you also have to set up the headers, which is the consumer key and consumer secrets. So over and create headers with authentication. So I initialize the HTTP headers, set the accept type to application JSON just like the previous one. Then further go on to provide the API key and API secrets and the set basic authentication for the HTTP headers and return headers. So this is just another reusable method I created to instantly go into the HTTP headers rather than me having to call it all the time. Because as you can see, I had many use cases of this method, create headers with authentication, because there will be many other methods that need header authentication. So why not just create a method that can be reused over and over again? I think this is one of the key things as a software engineer, creating reusable methods to save more memory and be more efficient in the long run. Create headers with authentication gets called multiple times, but right now let's just look at get all new customers. So after explaining this, we go back to the HTTP entity and initialize this as well with the headers and create our REST templates, which is essentially the get method. And if the HTTP status is okay, 200, then return the Woo customer array as a list. Now that we looked at this method, it's noteworthy to take note of the next method, the create WooCommerce customer, because this is one of the key things that will actually push our data from Shopify to WooCommerce. Remember, for Shopify, we had to use the get Shopify customer to get all the customers in that Shopify account. Then get our migration logic intact, and then follow up with creating individual WooCommerce customers. So let's look at this code for a second. First, we construct the URL for the WooCommerce API endpoint. Then we create HTTP headers with authentication details and set the content type to JSON, followed by creating a HTTP entity object that includes customer data to be sent to the headers. And then we send a post request to the WooCommerce API endpoint with the HTTP entity object. And as you know, the REST template exchange method sends the request and receives the response. And the response is a WooCommerce customer object based on our WooCommerce customer model that we created. And then we have our typical error handling. If the status code is 200, then it should successfully create the customer. If not, it logs the error message and throws a runtime exception. And this catch field catches errors in the range of network errors, such as error 500. And it also throws a runtime exception error that allows us to handle the error. Getting all the peripherals out of the way. But it's time to get to the main point. But before we do that, let's go back to our steps and procedures. So the last time we checked this, we were at step 3, which was to implement the data migration logic, create services or components responsible for fetching data from Shopify and pushing to WooCommerce. And we've done our authentications, we've done our data fetching, which is the get method for Shopify, and data pushing, which is the create method for WooCommerce. So now let's move on to the fourth one, data mapping and transformation. Now we have to implement logic to map and transform data between Shopify and WooCommerce formats. So let's take a look at our data for a second. WooCommerce has become our main priority now that we've handled Shopify. So we have the ID field, and this is of type int. But the ID field here is of type long. So what we can do is auto increment this after every new addition. Then we have the email field. Some email fields here are null, as some people didn't register with their email but their phone numbers through Shopify. So those kind of accounts wouldn't have emails. Unfortunately for WooCommerce, the email property cannot be not null. So we have to find the workaround around that. Then we have our first name, last name, password, data created, we can just take this created as and data modified. But note there are two different time types. And finally, we have the addresses. As you can see, some of the things here would work adequately apart from email. And email is a very important thing. So all we're going to do is map the Shopify address object to the WooCommerce address object. Then we have role. We will just set that to customer and we'll set its paying to false. So let's get on with our code. Now we move on to the service class, which is the customer migration service. So this class is responsible for migrating customer data from Shopify to WooCommerce. And I'm going to break down its functionality to you. First, it's annotated with add service, and that tells Java Spring Boot it's a service class. Then we move on to our controller method, which takes in both Shopify API client and WooCommerce API client, because we're going to need the functions from these two to migrate the service. Then we move on to the get WooCommerce address method. This is responsible for mapping a Shopify address object to a WooCommerce address object. So it takes in a Shopify address object and returns in total the WooCommerce address. Later onwards, we use this method for both billing and shipping addresses. Then we move on to migrate customer. So this method is responsible for the overall migration process. It first fetches the customer from Shopify. Then it migrates each customer to WooCommerce in parallel using Java's completable feature class for concurrency. This code also allows for parallel streaming. Why I use this method was to make the migration process more efficient. The first time I tried it without this method, it ended up working as I expected, but again, as I said, there are over 1,000 customers in Shopify. This took around 1 to 2 hours for everything to fully migrate, and from then I read up on how I could cut some time and better methods I could use than taking an hour for the migration process, and it led me to the completable feature class that Java provides. And it also logs the start of the migration to the end of the migration. And again, we have our catch block to catch any errors that may occur during the process. Then we move on to the migrate customer method. I had to create this method after using the computable feature class. So this migrates one customer at a time, but this migrates all customers together. So first, it checks if the customer email is equal to null. As I said before, one of the problems I encountered during this migration process was that the email field in WooCommerce has to be filled in. And for accounts that don't have an email field in Shopify, they got tagged as error. So I created a class called generate unique email. This method generates a unique email address for customers who don't have an email address in Shopify. So it simply returns a string that resembles an email address, but it starts with no customer with a random UUID number and ends with at example.com. So it's up to the customer once they log into their account on WooCommerce to change it as they please. Going back to the migrate customer method, it then checks if the email already exists. As I said before, it's a continuous migration process. So imagine if new members sign up on Shopify, right, and they want to use this migration process again. For customers that have already been migrated to WooCommerce, it would cause a problem knowing that, okay, these two fields have similar emails. So I made sure to skip those that already have existing emails in the WooCommerce account. So it tells us that customer followed by that email address already exists in WooCommerce, and it skips that field and proceeds to the next migration. So for those accounts who aren't already migrated, it then transforms them from Shopify customers to WooCommerce customers, as you can see here, and it uses the transform to WooCommerce customer method. So let's take a look at this. As you would assume, this transforms a Shopify customer object to a WooCommerce customer object, and it maps the properties of the Shopify customers to the WooCommerce customers, including billing and shipping. As you can see, this creates a new instantiation, sets email to get Shopify email, sets first name to first name, set last name to last name, sets usernames to get first name dot get last name, set the password to the already existing password for that Shopify customer. As I mentioned before, the data types for the dates of creations aren't the same on Shopify and WooCommerce. Shopify, it's a string, and on WooCommerce is of type local datetime. So it sets Shopify's date of creation to WooCommerce date of creation, and the same goes for the date modified and updated as fields on respective e-commerce accounts. Then we map the billing and shipping address. So if the Shopify get address is not null or it's not empty, if it's a string, it will map it to the get WooCommerce address, taking in the Shopify address and the Shopify customer. So we set the billing and the shipping information to the singular address provided by the Shopify user. Another problem we faced was with the usernames. If we recall, we set the usernames of WooCommerce customers to get first name and get last name from Shopify customers. So take for instance, they do not provide first names and last names from the Shopify account. That would imply that there would be multiple fields that would have null usernames. And for some reason, WooCommerce doesn't allow that either. So we had to create a custom method to set the username of the WooCommerce customer to null customer plus a random string. And the random string is of a math.random input. And there you have it. This marks the end of the transform to WooCommerce customer. And I believe I adequately and efficiently mapped each field from the Shopify customer object to each one in the WooCommerce customer object that required attention. Then once we go back to our migrate customer, we see that this is where we stopped. It then proceeds to call this method, creates WooCommerce customer, and it takes in the WooCommerce customer object that was created. And upon the successful migration, it logs the information customer migrated to WooCommerce successfully with the email of the customer that was migrated. And if there were any errors, it catches it as well. And so we go to the controller method, the migration controller method, and create an API endpoint for this, in which we can test in Postman to see if it works. So the endpoint basically calls the migrate customers method from the service class and returns a response entity. Okay, customer migration from Shopify to WooCommerce completed successfully. And in the case of any troubles, it also catches any internal server errors like error 500 or network errors during the process. And you can see that I've done this for both customers, products, and orders. So the next thing to do now is to test this method out on Postman. But first, we have to run the application. And great, our application has actually started. So let's head on to Postman and try it out. But you have to take note of something during this migration process. Remember, for the previous two methods we wanted to test on Postman, that we had to provide authorizations, basically the username and password. Over here, we have to provide all authorizations, including the Shopify access token, so that you can, one, access our Shopify account to get the customers, and two, be able to push information into WooCommerce. So we have to provide the API admin access token and our consumer key and secrets. So if we try this out, we should see that it has started the customer migration service. And nice, the only customer that we have, phoenixakano13@gmail.com, has been migrated successfully to WooCommerce. We can then proceed to go to WooCommerce and check it out for ourselves if something has actually been done. Follower account has actually been shifted into WooCommerce from Shopify, and it gives you the dates, the email, username, our name, and other than that, it also moves our address as we intended to. So we can see here Magodo GRA phase 1, address, city, state, everything that we expect from Shopify. You can see our default address here is also the same. It's also the same as the address over here. And if you go back and check Postman, you also see our response saying customer migration from Shopify to WooCommerce completed successfully with a status of 200. And note the time as well. Due to the fact that it does parallel streaming, the time range significantly reduced. So all is working as it's intended to, but there are still more steps to take after this to ensure that we actually completed this project successfully. The fifth step was error handling and logging, which we heavily focused on in all parts of our codes. So implement robust error handling to manage issues that may arise. If you kept track up to here, you notice that we handled errors for error 500, error 400, error 401, and so on and so forth. Then the next thing that we have to do, which is very crucial, is setting up a testing environment. Because I've completed this project, I did not bother to use a testing environment as I know that it works. But as of that time, I heavily relied on testing environments before I actually implemented the migration service as a whole. So we always have to remember to set up testing environments for the migration service and test it with sample data to ensure that the process is smooth and error-free. Then the next thing is security. Securely store your API credentials and sensitive information. Make sure you store them in your application properties file. You don't just store them randomly in a variable in any file accessible to the general public. And there you have it. This marks the end of the migration service. And as you can see, we also did one for products and we also did one for orders, but it isn't here as I haven't pushed to GitHub yet. Number 10, documentation, and number 11, deployment. So when it comes to documentation, you have to create comprehensive documentation for your projects in general and include information on how to set up, configure the service, handle errors, troubleshoot, and other common issues. As a developing software engineer, it shows that you're very organized with your code and you're very organized in the way it's put out to the public for other people to be able to easily use. And for number 11, deployment, you deploy your Spring Boot application to a production environment, possibly Heroku. You can consider using tools like Docker for containing your project so it can efficiently run on everyone's system and ease of deployment. But for this project, since it was more of a custom service to a particular client, I didn't feel the need to deploy it, but it's posted on my GitHub if you'd like to take a look at it further on. Another thing when it comes to deployment is I felt the need to create a front-end page Nothing too savvy, nothing too much. Maybe just one web page that prompts you to put in information for your specific app on both Shopify and WooCommerce and your access token and authorizations for WooCommerce. Same way Cat to Cat does theirs. But that would mean restructuring the system in some minor ways. So on the back end, you'd have to restructure it in such a way that the API endpoints in the migration controller methods accepts inputs from the front end, and these inputs will be your passwords and other sensitive data. So something like that may be skeptical to some people. And I think one of the reasons Cards invented the plugin was to avoid that route of forcing people to go the manual way and create an application on both Shopify and WooCommerce and provide the token for them. So that's why I cut back on the idea of creating a front end page for this project and left it as a fully backend project. Thank you for watching. Till next time.